The story begins with a young man recording a video at home at night. Very scared by various creepy sounds, he claims that something is walking on the roof and decides to go investigate. Something seems to be hiding behind the chimney, and when the young man screams, a pair of glowing eyes appears in the darkness. The scare causes him to fall badly, and it is then that we find out this is all a hoax. The so-called monster is actually a YouTuber named Devon in a costume, and his assistant is named Jamal. Their channel specializes in paranormal events and is very successful, but Devon believes it's time to take the next step. He wants to turn this work into a documentary series and says they could look for real monsters. Jamal feels a bit awkward warning his boss that they don't exist, but then Devon explains that it doesn't matter. Even if the creatures are fake, the audience wants to believe they are real so much that it won't be hard to convince them. Excited by the possibilities, Jamal names the idea Monster Project, and Devon posts an announcement, stating he is looking for real monsters for a documentary. He emphasizes that he will not accept actors but says the project is open to anyone who has been affected by paranormal forces. Next, we see a young man named Brian recording a video for his parents. He mentions how many days he has been sober and recounts a conversation he had with a priest about the inner duel between good and evil. The video is interrupted by his friend Muriel talking about Brian's birthday celebration. Meanwhile, Devon is already on the hunt for monsters for his show. Narrating everything for the camera, he says he is going to a Native American reserve for a meeting with one of the candidates. His name is Steven, and he claims to be a skinwalker, which is a mix of werewolf and shapeshifter. Jamal feels uneasy with the unfriendly signs, and we see that something is spying on the duo when they arrive. Trying to calm his assistant, Devon says Steven is a police officer, but Jamal responds that being black makes him even more nervous. The camera battery dies just as Steven appears. The next thing we see is Devon scolding Jamal. Because he forgot the extra battery in the car, they ended up missing the conversation with Steven. Despite this, both are excited about the candidate as he seems to be a legitimate monster. That night, we learn that Muriel is Jamal's sister and Devon's ex-girlfriend. She is furious to see her ex again after their abrupt breakup some time ago. Brian is spending time at the siblings' house and is shocked by Jamal's lack of awareness, suggesting they find another place to work. However, Devon says there's a lot to do and just ignores Brian. In the room, he tells Jamal that the second candidate is a vampire named Shayla. She works as a tattoo artist at night and agreed to participate in exchange for food. When Jamal realizes this means blood, he is offended by the offer of $100 and hands the job to Brian, who is broke enough to accept. The three then go to make the delivery at a park bench indicated by Shayla. Jamal takes the opportunity to film everything, including the creepy sounds that suddenly start. Then, the jar disappears from the bench without anyone seeing who took it. Devon loves all of this, convinced that the candidates are just as fake as he is, and impressed by the level of performance. Being religious, Brian thinks differently and finds it a bad idea to be playing with such things because the devil can reach us in various ways. In the middle of the night, someone knocks on Jamal's door and leaves a DVD for him. The video shows a girl named Shirori who claims to be under some sort of possession. Jamal nearly has a heart attack when Brian's crucifix suddenly falls from the wall, as if affected by the girl's dark words. Devon contacts her immediately, ignoring his friend's protests. When Jamal mentions Brian's earlier warnings, Devon just laughs, saying he won't take advice from an addict. Jamal replies that Brian has gotten rid of the problem and, besides that, he has been through many horrible things in life. As soon as Devon says that there's no recovery for people like him, the two hear the bedroom door closing and realize the guest heard everything. A few days later, Jamal and Muriel organize a birthday party for Brian, who seems uncomfortable with all the attention. Sensing a suspicious interaction, Jamal confronts the birthday boy about a possible relapse and Brian shows he was only given a condom. Jamal apologizes, but Brian is hurt since he overheard that conversation. He says Devon is no good and thinks Jamal acts differently in his company. At that moment, Devon himself shows up at the party, despite not being invited. He hands Brian an envelope with $600, explaining that it's not a gift but rather a job offer as a filming assistant. He claims to regret his insensitive comments and wants to help Brian get back on his feet. Muriel loses her patience again seeing Devon around, but he has an ace up his sleeve this time. Knowing her dream is to be a director, he offers to hire her for the monster project, guaranteeing it will be a successful endeavor that can launch her career. At the end of the party, Brian tries to get closer to Muriel, and they kiss, but she decides to stop there before things get complicated. After she goes to sleep, Brian has a brief outburst of anger. On the eve of a lunar eclipse, Devon takes the team to the creepy and completely isolated old house he rented for the project. The owner is named Richard, and he doesn't like being filmed. Brian tries to talk to Muriel about that kiss, but she refuses to touch on the subject and says she doesn't want to ruin their friendship. Richard explains the excessive security, saying the house was the headquarters of a satanic group in the 60s and, for that reason, is often invaded by curious people. The group already thinks this is a bad idea when Devon still asks them to leave their cell phones in the car to avoid interruptions. Entering the house, Richard starts talking to someone named Marta when Jamal notices that there are cameras installed even inside the house. Right at that moment, one of the doors opens by itself, and Devon sees a woman in a wheelchair, whispering something about the moon. Richard soon appears and continues to show them the rooms until Marta suddenly starts screaming. He hugs her and calms her down, deciding to end the tour quickly. He also warns Devon that no one should enter the attic due to the rotting wood. After Richard and Marta leave, Devon shows them the props he brought to spice up the interviews, like stakes and crucifixes. Muriel goes down to the basement to turn on the power and Brian offers to accompany her. Speaking about Devon, he gets upset to see her hurt fading and she is already considering giving him a second chance. In the main room, Devon tries to record an introduction, and it doesn't take long for reality to start blending with fiction. Shiori's arrival is marked by unexplained sounds throughout the house, while some of the cameras begin to malfunction. Devon asks her to wait in the dressing room, and she responds in plural as if there's another person with her. Brian is tasked with hanging the identification on each door. Arriving at Shiori's reserved room, he decides to check on her and finds her laughing alone. Soon afterward, a blurry image appears on his camera for a brief moment. Jamal is keeping an eye on the entrance and gets startled when the vampire arrives. Following tradition, Shayla asks to be invited in before passing through the doorway. She thanks for the previous treat, seeming to know whose blood it was. Brian becomes increasingly shaken by all this and goes outside to smoke, repeating to himself that it's just one night. Shiori appears in the background of the hallway in a ghostly manner and then disappears very quickly. A strange voice starts speaking to Brian through a modulator, and then we find out it's Steven, the skinwalker. He prefers not to reveal his identity as, aside from being a police officer, the indigenous people of his tribe do not approve of discussing the phenomenon openly. Steven affirms that he protects his people from others like him but also confesses that his participation in the program is an act of revenge. He suddenly stands up and alters his tone of voice as Devon begins discussing research on the subject. Apparently, the only way to become a skinwalker is by taking the life of someone in your own family. Steven does not clarify this point but agrees to describe the experience in detail, making it clear that his animal side takes control during the transformation. The next participant is Shayla, and she asks to be interviewed by Brian. Devon reluctantly agrees, and she begins to behave inappropriately, diverting questions to issues like addiction and making Brian uncomfortable. Pressured to show the tattoo on her thigh, he reveals a series of initials and denies they are from old girlfriends. The situation only worsens when she mentions the taste she felt when she took the contents of that jar, revealing that Brian is not as sober as he claims. His friends become outraged by his lies. Brian then suffers another outburst of rage and, seeming close to completely losing control, rushes out of the room. Jamal follows him to the bathroom and takes a pill bottle from his pocket, telling his friend that it's better to find another place to live. The last interviewee is Shiori, and she says she has been tormented by an evil man since she was born. He is always smiling, despite having no lips, and his appearance is animalistic. She claims he promised to leave her alone if she participated in the documentary. After showing the scratches on her back, Shiori begins screaming that he has arrived. She points to a corner of the room where no one is and the lights suddenly go out. Muriel goes down to the basement to fix the problem, but gets startled by a noise on the way and catches Steven ripping the boards off a window to see the lunar eclipse, which is right at its peak. His body contorts whole, his clothes begin to rip, and he bares his fangs at Muriel with a fierce growl. She runs to close the door and tells the others they need to get out of that house now. Shirori is curled up in the hallway and Muriel tries to convince her to flee as well. It's then that her face also transforms and she levitates to the ceiling, terrifying everyone. While Devon tries to find the keys, Stephen has already knocked down the door and even Shayla begins to be affected by the eclipse. Muriel, Jamal, and Devon manage to get into a smaller room, but Stephen's paw breaks through the wall and grabs Jamal, pulling the young man away. Muriel and Devon begin running through the house, trying to find Jamal and escape the monsters. Meanwhile, Brian is still lost in thought when Jamal's screams reach him. Soon, the other two find him and explain what happened. Muriel is terrified but doesn't want to flee without her brother. Then, Devon hands out the weapons he brought thinking they would only be decorative, and the three head out to hunt monsters. Brian finds Shirori at the end of a hallway, quietly crying. He tries to help her, but she transforms again and attacks him. After Brian recovers, Jamal starts screaming from upstairs, and the three rush up the stairs. They find him injured and scared, but still with his weapon in hand. Jamal explains that he shot Stephen 4 times and still couldn't bring him down. Soon after, the same thing happens with Shayla when she attacks them on the staircase. The shots only manage to delay her, and even then, not by much. Muriel is the last one down and ends up captured by the vampire. Devon and Brian rush back up to try to save her, but Shayla throws them aside effortlessly. When the vampire jumps on Brian, Jamal surprises her from behind with a stake and finally manages to defeat her. Although he has been saved, Muriel has a nasty bite on her neck. The group barely recovers from the attack when Stephen appears again, now fully transformed into a werewolf. Brian unloads his gun on him and nothing happens. Once again, it is Jamal who saves the day, shutting the door before the beast can get in. The young people then attempt to go around the rooms to reach the exit, but stop when they hear Shirori crying again. Armed with a crucifix, Brian flings open the door to a closet and finds it empty. Then Muriel opens the other door and finds Shirori in her human form. It's obvious that the girl is in great pain, and Muriel does not agree to leave her in the house with the werewolf. His growls are closing in, and there isn't much time to think. Thus, the group decides to take Shirori along while she's not possessed. Stephen attacks Brian and Devon on the way, but the two manage to escape. However, they discover that all the exits are blocked from the outside, and Brian remembers hearing hammering. With few options, Devon calls the others to go down to the basement. The werewolf slams the door after the last one passes and they need to fight to push him back before closing. Shirori becomes very agitated when she sees that there's a pentagram drawn on the floor. Determined to find an exit, Brian crawls through a crack into a sort of chimney but comes face to face with a creature that looks like a goat. He starts to back away and hears his friends warning him that Shirori is possessed again. She attacks him right afterward, and even holy water doesn't hold her for long. Brian manages to join the others, but Shirori continues to pursue him, repeating in a deep voice that he will pay for his sins. Not knowing much of what they are doing, the young people hold Shirori to the ground and begin to improvise an exorcism. Brian is the most suited for the task, being the only one who knows the rites. But Shirori soon breaks free and throws everyone across the basement before lunging at him with her mouth open. Brian finds himself transported back to his birthday party. However, he sees himself from the outside of his body, and just as he's about to blow out the candles, everyone freezes. He barely turns his back, and the guests appear lined up right behind him, all possessed as well. Shortly after, he is haunted by visions of deceased friends who blame him for selling them a contaminated lot. He begins to cry and beg for forgiveness, but his victims also transform into demons, constantly calling him a murderer. When Brian finally confronts Shirori in his delirium, he comes back to reality and manages to finish the ritual. The whole house begins to shake, and Shirori falls sad on the ground. Everyone is startled to see her eyes have vanished, but the worst fright is yet to come. The demon has not completely left and begins to manifest in Muriel's body, announcing that its name is Baphomet and warning that someone is about to arrive. Jamal is thrown away while Devon and Brian try to contain her. Another exorcism happens, and Muriel ends up fainting. Seeing Shirori possessed again, they realize there's no way to save her and Brian starts hitting her with the cross until he sees her fall down lifeless. Muriel wakes up very scared, but visibly free from possession. When she asks about her brother, Brian and Devon realize that he hasn't returned since he was thrown away. Searching the basement with the camera lights, they find Jamal trying to hide. The wound on his back has developed ominously, and he seems to be undergoing a transformation. Just then, Stephen manages to burst through the boards and enter the basement. Everyone rushes to ascend the stairs, but Jamal refuses to accompany them. He knows his end has come and only asks Brian to protect his sister. Soon afterward, Stephen attacks him, and Brian runs to join the others. Upon reaching the top, he sees that, unfortunately, Muriel is also not well, as Shayla's bite is beginning to take effect. As this delays their escape, Stephen catches up with them again and they end up separating. The werewolf pursues Brian and stalks him through the doorway until lured by a sort of howl. In another room, Muriel is already at her last and Devon is behaving strangely. He coldly steps away while she begs for his help and says that she has always been part of his plans. She starts to writhe and scream until she falls inert. Brian is searching for the others when a very strange figure appears in the doorway, wearing a goat mask and saying he is about to arrive. Quickly closing the door, Brian runs through the house until he finds Muriel fallen and goes into despair. To make matters worse, she resurrects and lunges at him. Brian tries to stop her with kicks but barely has time to check if he was bitten before she lunges again. Forced to defend himself as he can, he tears off a piece of a chair, creating an improvised stake, and hits the vampire in the skull. Horrified by yet another loss, he bids her farewell and apologizes for not being able to save her. Without giving the young man a minute of peace, the werewolf appears in the doorway, growling grotesquely. Brian runs upstairs and manages to lock himself in one of the rooms just in time. Knowing that the door will not withstand the monster's fury, he tears the boards from the window and jumps into the garden. However, Stephen smashes the door almost at the same time and jumps as well, suffering much less from the fall. Brian struggles to get up and flees into the underbrush, running aimlessly until he reaches another house. To his horror, Stephen is already perched on the fence, waiting to attack him. Brian arms himself with a steel bar and then uses the enemy's strength to his advantage by lying down on the ground and letting the werewolf charge. Stephen falls into the trap and ends up impaled, allowing Brian to escape further into the house. It is then that he notices the symbols drawn on the walls and sees a photo of Devon in the middle of the pentagram. The man with the goat mask appears again, and Devon himself emerges from the other door, full of sarcasm. Not understanding anything, Brian kneels and begins to pray. Devon throws him against the ceiling with a gesture, demonstrating supernatural powers. Moments later, Brian wakes up tied to a chair in front of a pentagram. The victims of that terrible night are positioned on top of the symbol, and some people stand around him. When Devon approaches, Brian accuses him of having killed all his friends. Realizing that all of this is culminating in his own sacrifice, he asks why he was chosen. In a demonic voice, Devon says it was because of his faith and confesses to having planned everything that has occurred that night. Richard removes the goat mask and begins the ritual, always referring to Devon as the master. Brian begins to pray over the ominous words announcing the arrival of the Antichrist, until both are screaming. When Richard stops speaking, Marta suddenly approaches with a dagger and slits the young man's throat, letting everything pour into a chalice. She brings the hellish drink to her master, and the house begins to tremble right afterward. Devon's shadow grows until it nearly covers the entire wall, and we see that his transformation resembles an evil being, with bestial details and forms.